professionals here this evening. If you are an architectural historian, could you raise your hand, please? There are, yes, there they are, a healthy bunch out there. And if you were a student or interacted with Dr. Gebhard in your work or study, please raise your hand too. So it's a very congenial crowd who knows our subject matter tonight. Thank you for being here. Now, many of you associate the Pearl Chase Society with our annual fundraising event, the Historic Homes Tour, which we are planning to revive and reimagine during after our post-COVID lapse to continue our good works that fund our historical preservation. Perhaps you know of our longtime member and activist, Kellum DeForest, whose legacy inspired this speaker series. We gratefully acknowledge your support for this series, and donations are most welcome so that we can continue our good works in not only these events, but preservation and advocacy of our beloved city. This theater space was constructed in 1925 as the Pueblo Theater for the Santa Barbara School of the Arts, originally used for drama, music, and dance classes. Alice Schott, one of the city's most active community leaders for some 50 years, purchased the theater in 1939 after the school struggled through the Depression and renamed it the Al-Hikama, which I always thought was an Islamic name, but it comes from her 4 children, Alice, Helen, Catherine, and Mary Lou. Oh, big, yeah, I had that over too. She deeded the property to the City of Santa Barbara School District in 1945. The Al-Hikama Theater is now part of the El Presidio de Santa Barbara State Historic Park, and it was purchased by the state of California in 1982. The Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation stewards the past and present of the Presidio neighborhood while promoting the diversity of cultures and inspires preservation advocacy. The Pearl Chase Society shares these values of historic preservation, which prioritize the care and enhancements to the properties and historical resources for all types of users. Introducing tonight's speaker is an especially meaningful for me, as Dr. Bricker and I go, as they say, way back. We were both pupils of tonight's subject, Dr. Gebhard, during the time of our intersecting degrees at UC Santa Barbara. Lauren went on to write her doctoral dissertation under Dr. Gebhard on Roland Coates, a local famous Southern California architect, the first of many investigations of Southern California architects. Her appointment as professor of architecture at Cal State Polytechnic University Pomona was in 1999, where she taught courses in architectural history and historic preservation. She served at Cal Poly as interim dean of the environmental design and director of the archives special collections there for more than 20 years, and now you're recently retired. Hooray, hooray. She's written on modern landscape, post-war housing, Mediterranean house, individual Southern California architects, and other architectural historians. Historic preservation has been a focus of Dr. Bricker's professional activities. Her public lecture, if you're so inclined, Conserving the Vitality of Our Historic Places, is available on YouTube. Dr. Bricker served on the executive committee of the National Council for Historic Preservation. She held positions of architectural historian and chair on California State Historical Resources Commission. Currently, she is a member of Redlands Historic and Scenic Commission and is vice president of the historic Harada House Foundation in Riverside, which is where she and her husband David live currently. I could go on, but that's not what we're here for. Dr. Bricker.
Thank you, Janice. What a lovely, gracious introduction.
I really appreciate that very, very much. It's such an honor to be back in Santa Barbara. When Dennis invited me to give this lecture, I thought, oh, a great opportunity to reconnect with the legacy of David Gebhard and the city, and then my very dear friends, Dennis, of course, and also Mary Louise Days, who is one of our most respected historians and a wonderful friend of many years. I also want to express my appreciation for that David and Pat Gebhard's daughters, Ellen Gebhard Gates and Tara Gebhard Byers, have come quite a distance to be with us tonight. Ellen from San Juan Capistrano and Tara from Athens, Georgia. And in addition, Tara's eldest child, young man, Connor, is with us, as well as other family members. So it's really very, very special to have them with us. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention my appreciation and of course love of David Bricker. And I have to say that David Gebhard played a sort of unwitting matchmaker role for us, because we were both drawn to study with him. So it's all very, very nice. Okay, let me start. Images. An aerial view of Santa Barbara from about 1967, taken by Mark Hurd. In 1961, David and Pat Gebhard arrived in Santa Barbara. He had just been appointed, actually a dual appointment as professor of art history and director of the new UCSB art galleries. They must have been enthralled by the magnificent city, nestled as it is within the narrow shelf of land formed by the San Ynez Mountains and the south-facing Pacific coastline. These portraits are from the Gebhard family collection. We don't have hard dates for them, but the family believes that they may date from the early 1950s. The period that Gebhard was director of the Roswell Museum in New Mexico. This is more likely to be a portrait that depicts David Gebhard as many of us knew him. In the early 1960s, the city appeared to retain much of the character that was nurtured through the preservation efforts of Pearl Chase, Bernard and Irene Hoffman, and the generation of architects who rebuilt the city in the decade of the 1920s. However, Santa Barbara was clearly in a period of change. Population growth stimulated new housing tracts and traffic congestion, all conditions that Santa Barbara shared with other Southern California cities. One municipal response to these conditions was to hire Simon Eisner Associates, a leading Southern California city planner, to create a general plan for the city, which was completed in '64. In the plan, Eisner credited the surviving historic adobes and the Mission Complex as among the assets that distinguish Santa Barbara from other cities. He was particularly positive about the recently created historic district El Pueblo Viejo, which encompassed the city's historic core. This was one of the earliest historic districts in the nation and predated the adoption of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. It should be noted that Eisner's assessment of the city's attributes echoed views of two earlier planners, Charles M. Robinson and Charles Chaney. Cheney had been particularly effective in advising the city on the advantages of design review, which he saw as a systematic method for urban growth. The El Pueblo Viejo, and you're looking at the district as it exists today, in a somewhat expanded form. But from the start, it included design review, and initially that was in the hands of the Advisory Landmarks Committee. Over time, that process was strengthened, and by the 70s, there was a formation of the Landmarks Committee and the Historic Landmarks Commission. David Gebhard was a longtime member of both of those committees. We're looking at some views of the De La Guerra adobe, and from the early 1800s, and then sort of surrounding it, at least on two sides, is El Paseo, which is a work from 22 to 24, and then with later additions. And here's a plan. I hope you can make it out. Here's the De La Guerra adobe, and then El Paseo included this section. You're looking at it here on the right, which is called a street in Spain, and then it expanded. There's a courtyard to the rear, and then a restaurant, and then subsequently more construction, taking the project out to Anacapa, and also extending it to State Street. So this was a highly influential project that was undertaken, and the costs were covered by Bernard and Irene Hoffman, who believed very strongly that one of the opportunities that Santa Barbara presented was because of the proximity, the number of adobes we have, that there should, in effect, the benefit of those adobes could be augmented by new construction that was adjacent to them and sort of expanded the built environment in using an architectural language from, originally from Spain rather than Mexico, which of course was the origin for the adobes. The Hoffmans also funded the construction of Meridian Studios, which many of you may know. Just a wonderful project that began with an adobe, again, the Lugo adobe, and then he hired George Washington Smith, probably one of the city's most distinguished architects, to construct 4 studios that would be between the adobe and the street, and these were north-oriented. They really meant as artist studios. So it really was, there was a kind of energy that the Hoffmans and Pearl Chase, of course, really generated in these years, beginning in the early 1920s. Also, there was an enthusiasm for the idea of sort of redesigning the block faces along State Street, and particularly, but some of the other commercial streets. And what you're seeing here is a drawing from the office of George Washington Smith, with the drawing was done by Luda Maria Briggs, who worked for him for many years. The idea of creating these prototypes, urban prototypes, actually went back to the years immediately after the 1915 fair in San Diego, and they invited Bertram Goodhue, the primary architect of that fair, to create something similar. But of course, and I think we all know this, those of us who are immersed in the history of Santa Barbara, we know that this, there was some implementation of these ideas, but what really got things going in a kind of a strange way was the 1925 earthquake, which necessitated the rebuilding of State Street in particular, but many of the other downtown buildings, and much of the thinking had already been initiated. The history is actually very interesting. I won't go through all the details right now, but the history of the rebuilding of Santa Barbara after the earthquake was remarkable in how systematic it was. You know, that there was this strong commitment to design review, consistent design, consistency in you know, the vocabulary of the architecture, and with the view, and these ideas were seeded by Charles Chaney, with the view that that was going to be a very effective way to create a city where there was a kind of a systematic growth and development, and also I believe he used the word in a peaceful way. You know, we of course, we're very aware of the commitment that is ongoing in Santa Barbara to the what was initially referred to as the Californian style of architecture, and then it gradually developed the label of the Spanish colonial or Spanish revival style. All right, so back to the Gebhards in particular. So prior to their arrival in Santa Barbara, David and Pat were on a Fulbright scholarship to Turkey, where he lectured on architectural history at the Istanbul Technical University. Among the works of contemporary American architecture that he included in his presentations was Charles and Ray Eames's house in Pacific Palisades, and you're seeing a view of it on the left, and this was number 8 in the Arts and Architecture's case study house program, very much of the moment. He was obviously extremely current in terms of his knowledge of contemporary architecture. While they were in Turkey, the Gebhards also had a shared research project which was on the traditional wooden houses of Turkey. And some of them were initiated during the Ottoman Empire and could roughly date from the 1400s to the early 20th century. What I'm showing you on the right is a drawing of some of these houses in Istanbul, made by a very distinguished American architect and historian, A.D.F. Hamlin. And this is a sketch from the 1890s. So, Gebhard was a native Minnesotan, and but his introduction to California architecture was in 1952 when he visited the architect William Gray Purcell, who was living in Los Angeles. Gebhard's dissertation from the University of Minnesota was on the Prairie School architecture of Purcell and his partner George Grant Elmsley. Because Purcell was infirm during Gebhard's visit, he asked Esther McCoy, whose portrait you see on the left, to introduce him to the local architectural scene. McCoy at the time was a regular contributor to the LA Times Home magazine, extremely well informed on contemporary architecture in Los Angeles and California as a whole. She was a trained architect and had worked for R.M. Schindler in his studio residence on Kings Road in West Hollywood before she embarked on her writing career. We can assume that Schindler's buildings figured prominently on McCoy's tour, along with works by other architects she wrote about, including Irving Gill, Richard Neutra, and Harwell Hamilton Harris. She was soon to publish her influential volume, 5 California Architects, and you're seeing an original edition. If you have one of these in your bookshelf, you count yourself very fortunate. It's extremely valuable. Most of us bought the second, third, fourth edition, whatever it was. And for many of us, frankly, this was the book that got us to come to California. and very, very important book. And if you don't have it, I recommend that you get it, check it out from the library, or just go ahead, take the dive and buy yourself a copy, because it's a beautiful piece of architectural writing. All right, so McCoy proved to be very inspiring to Gebhard. His first monograph was on Schindler, which was published in 1970. Gebhard and his close friend and co-author Robert Winter were highly influenced by McCoy. In their first edition of a guide to Southern California architecture, published in 1965 by the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the authors credited McCoy's publications, which by that time included her volume on Neutra and the Case Study House program. They acknowledged that their knowledge of Southern California's architectural heritage was due to her one-woman crusade. Moreover, in their view, her writing, quote, made America and the world aware of California's tremendous contribution to the 20th century. So I'm showing you on the left a copy of the first edition, and the first two editions focused on Southern California as a whole. The next 4 editions covered, were pretty focused on just Los Angeles County, and you're seeing the final edition on the right. These guidebooks obviously were extremely successful, and for many of us, for quite a long time, we would keep copies of them in our cars, and we refer to them as our architectural Bibles. Okay, so David Gebhard exuded tremendous productive energy. He was always thoroughly prepared for any task, so when he turned his attention on a project such as an exhibition or a writing assignment or class preparation, he applied the full intensity of his intellectual or physical energy. His work at the galleries, now known as the UCSB Art, Architecture, and Design Museum, was a major focus of his work, his activities. Marla Burns, the museum director who succeeded Gebhard, described him as, quote, a creative genius with an ambitious exhibition schedule of 10 or more shows each academic year on a wide range of subjects. She also observed that few university museums, or any museum for that matter, were doing exhibitions on architectural history as he did. His first architectural exhibition was on architect George Washington Smith, and on the left I'm showing you a view of Smith's first house, which is also known as the Heberton House in Montecito from 1916. Gebhard really had a very strong, profound connection with Smith's work. He believed the simplicity of his architecture, which derived from sources in the Andalusian region of Spain, was highly influential on the architecture of Santa Barbara. In 1980, Gebhard was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship to travel in Spain and identify sources for the Spanish Revival architecture among works in rural Spain. This was in preparation for his book on Smith, which he never wrote. Pat Gebhard published a beautiful monograph on Smith on David's behalf. Many of Gebhard's exhibitions included architectural drawings and photographs that had been donated to the museum, such as, for example, the drawing by R.M. Schindler of the Oliver House in Los Angeles from 1933. Beginning with the Schindler collection, Gebhard created the Architectural Drawing Collection, now the Architecture and Design Collection. Over the decades, he amassed one of the most significant archives of architectural records in the nation. He recognized that drawings and photographs were invaluable as documentation of a building and were often quite beautiful works of art. It was also important to Gebhard that his graduate students work with the drawings as a supplement to the experience of working in an architect's office. David Gebhard is often spoken of as principally a historian of California architecture. However, a quick review of his resume challenges that view. He wrote on topics of national interest, for example, his extensive research on the Anglo-colonial revival of the 1930s, which focused on works largely based in the Northeast with a particular focus on Royal Berry Wills. Moving further east, Gebhard organized an exhibition with accompanying catalog on Charles F.A. Voysey, a major figure of the English arts and crafts movement. He also wrote on the architecture and furniture of the Viennese Secession, with particular focus on Joseph Hoffman. The breadth of knowledge he also included his interest in contemporary works by Robert Venturi, Hans Hollein in Vienna, James Sterling in the UK, and I'm sure there are many others. His prominence in the Society of Architectural Historians, he was named president and held that position from 1982 to 84, put him in league with many of the most prominent historians. Full views of our beloved Santa Barbara County Courthouse. David Gebhard considered the courthouse to be one of the city's most significant monuments, yet the origins of the design of the courthouse remained unresolved up till the time he was preparing the bicentennial exhibition, Santa Barbara, the creation of a new Spain, which was held in 1982. San Francisco architect William Mouger was long credited with the design of the courthouse, and you're seeing one of his drawings for the competition that was held in 1919. On the right are some drawings made by Edgar Matthew, who actually won the competition. Clearly, neither of these designs had anything to do with what was actually constructed. Gebhard had an instinctive feeling that Santa Barbara architects had played a role in the transformation of the Spanish Renaissance design that you're seeing here into one that had more to do with the informal Spanish-style practice in Santa Barbara that was unique and not dependent on the precedent of any one building. Additionally, the level of integration of landscape architecture was exceptional in our courthouse, even in a period where public buildings included some level of landscape setting. Following the 1919 competition for the courthouse, there was a delay owing to issues related to funding, and Pat Gebhard and Catherine Masson detail this history beautifully in their volume on the Santa Barbara Courthouse. If you haven't read that volume, I encourage you to do so. One thing that happened early on was the removal of a memorial hall from this scheme that, of course, was going to be dedicated to wounded and deceased from World War I. So the whole project languished again until the earthquake of 1925, when the existing 1872 brick courthouse was severely damaged, and clearly the city had to do something. And they turned to their second place winner. You can imagine the kind of hurt feelings associated with that. Second place winner, and largely because his firm brought a tremendous previous experience with courthouse construction. Only when the cost of the building, which actually is comprised of 4 structures, could be reduced or at least phased a funding scheme was identified, did the city feel it could proceed. The sentiment surfaced, though, that something had to happen with the design. It still didn't have a look like a Santa Barbara building. Another architectural committee was formed, and there was a lot of dissension in the committee. And George A. Batchelder, a very influential local businessman with quite a bit of knowledge about how to get projects done. He is credited with the development of the Riviera section of the city. He stepped into the process. He was familiar with architects and designers working in the community drafting room, which had been set up in conjunction with efforts to try to move review of projects along post-earthquake. Among the people in the office was a young designer named J. Wilmer Hershey, a talented young designer. And Batchelder had already come to the conclusion, he had a lot of authority, had come to the conclusion that the courthouse ought to be organized around a central open space, not smack in the middle of the block with the landscape around it. Batchelder asked Hershey to work on the project, and I hope you can see these views. Virtually overnight, he developed the courthouse form and composition that we have today. Clearly, if you looking at the model on the right, clearly there was initially it was projected to have a much more formal landscape treatment in the center of the courthouse complex. That, of course, became more of a sunken garden, utilizing the foundation, some of the foundations from the 1872 structure that had been demolished. A number of talented sculptors, muralists, and experts were brought into the design process. I'm sure you're aware of this. Ettore Caterin designed the exterior sculptures that you see in part here. Dan Sayre Grosbeck painted the murals in the superintendent's room, and others are credited with painting the ceilings and designing the magnificent tile work that we enjoy today. The landscape architecture of the courthouse was largely credited to Ralph Stevens, who was a very accomplished landscape architect in his day. And of course, others have added to that over time, including most recently the firm Campbell and Campbell, who've made some important and very subtle modifications to the landscape to assure that the grounds are accessible. Other work that has been done on the courthouse more recently of an architectural nature was designed by Charles Moore and Sharp Mahan Lenny, and then also Campbell and Campbell were involved. All of this in order to make the building ADA compliant. Moore was actually very knowledgeable and enamored of the courthouse. In the 1960s, when he was chair of the Department of Architecture at UC Berkeley, he used to write to Pearl Chase in preparation for bringing groups of students to Santa Barbara. Moore and one of his partners, Gerald Allen, wrote about the courthouse in the 1970s. He called it, quote, a catalog and synthesis of all the things that the Santa Barbarans and their architects were up to. It is a confection that is like many things, but accurate to nothing. There is no precise, scholarly adherence to anything, but in establishing its own principles, the building pays passionate romantic allegiance to a half-imagined past. Moore thought the courthouse was scaled to a gigantic landscape, not an urban landscape, but a plain. such as the plain that is defined by the mountains and the Pacific Ocean, i.e. Santa Barbara. In his view, the composition of its white walls and giant plants casting shadows wasn't particularly Spanish. The Spanish landscape tradition had a tendency to create enclosed plazas and courtyards. This was a landscape that was much more open and embracing. Additionally, and this is my view, when you're at the courthouse, for instance, as in this view, and you're looking through that magnificent archway, what you see is the landscape and the mountains beyond through the opening. And I think it very much figures into our important tradition of democratic space that characterizes some of the most important public spaces in this country. The Village Green, in New England, Central Park in New York, the University of Virginia. These are places that are importantly associated with the practice and symbol of free speech. It was no accident that Charles Moore had an opportunity to work on the courthouse, nor that he got the commission to design UCSB's faculty club years earlier, from 1967 to 68. You're looking at a couple of views. A drawing, a presentation drawing on the left, and on the right, the dining room as it originally appeared. Gebhard had great respect for Charles Moore. Gebhard's friend, the Santa Barbara architect Jeffrey Holroyd, noted that in spite of the ascendancy of the international style in the 1960s, as we have seen, Gebhard never believed that it was the single style of the 20th century, the only style. He saw he meaning Gebhard, saw the first hole of the accepted theory came from some young architects in England in the 1950s, followed by a fresh American viewpoint in the early 60s by Charles Moore and Robert Venturi. An architecture of great diversity began in the US, a diversity Gebhard approved. In fact, these architects were among Gebhard's professional friends. I've mentioned this. And he not only approved of their work, but he promoted it, clearly. Gebhard played an instrumental role in Moore and Turnbull being hired for the faculty club. They were two members of the four-person team responsible for the recently completed Condominium 1 in Sea Ranch in Sonoma County, which enjoyed international acclaim. The faculty club building survives today, but in a much altered, some might say improved condition. I would not be among them. For our purposes today, I'm most interested in sharing some of Gebhard's thoughts about the building as a reflection of California and specifically Santa Barbara architecture. He understood that Moore saw the commission as, quote, an opportunity to sample and comment on the tasty architectural fare of Southern California. And Santa Barbara was a delicious and added enticement, for here was a place whose whole imagery as reality and as wish was the most impressive stage set to be found in Southern California. No other community of the Southland had, over such a long period of time, more passionately embraced the Spanish colonial revival tradition than Santa Barbara. In Gebhard's view, in one stroke, Moore and Turnbull have reinstated the Spanish colonial revival tradition and have made it part of our contemporary architectural scene. Just to clarify what we're looking at here. So this is on the drawing on the left. So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the faculty club, but in case you haven't visited it. So it faces the lagoon on campus. And you can see it has this wonderful kind of meandering pattern. The principal entrance was off to the left out of the view of this drawing. and you entered from the second floor, and then you drop down, and then you have this really quite dramatic staircase. Gebhard was very fond of calling this a kind of a Piranesian type of interior where you have this sort of complex staircases and movement like you see here. Then there was a secondary entrance off to this side, which is really what most people used. And then you had a series of offices, and on the upper floor there were guest quarters. It turned out that the faculty club was actually very unpopular with the faculty. They had a hard time seeing humor as having a place in their campus lives. Just with regard to the humor, on the right, so you see these, there were neon banners that really were very delightful, but kind of poke fun at the tradition of having kind of medieval banners in these great eating clubs that you find in universities on the East Coast. Some of them were actually constructed in corduroy as well. So there was a heavy dose of humor here. There were other spaces that are outside the view of this photo that were really quite interesting. The university had purchased a number of remnants from the Hearst estate, including some decorative cork ornaments and that they put on the wall, and also some fragments of sculpture. And it was very, very lively and really quite unusual. We're looking at a couple of views of the Gebhard family residence in Montecito from 1967. As the ultimate indicator of respect and trust, when David Gebhard began the process of designing the family house in Montecito, he consulted with Charles Moore. The resulting contemporary was built on a hillside lot. An elevated platform was the communal space, and you can see that here. It's a little bit difficult to read. It was a communal space dividing the library, which you see in the view on the right, from the public spaces of the house. Bedrooms were on 2 levels towards the rear of the house, and you get a sense of them in this view here. The library may reflect Moore's input. Its tower-like form with a moving staircase, which was actually based on a Voisey design. You can see here we have a little heart at the top. Really is similar to some other work that Moore had designed. So there may have been some specific input. We know that certainly Gebhard consulted with Moore. Unfortunately, the house has been significantly altered today. Looking at a view, this is a recent view of the entrance to the Santa Barbara Museum of Art on the left, and on the right is a view of the Barcelona building, this building here on Chapala Street. That is the work of Sharp Mahan and Lenny. Writing in 1985 on the subject of the Santa Barbara Hispanic tradition, David Gebhard referenced the changes that had been made to the museum by that point, which were largely the work of David Adler and then subsequently of Warner and Gray. This is a very interesting essay. He recognized that conforming to the California Spanish Revival was also seen by practicing architects as limiting their creativity. Traditional architecture was seen as antithetical to modernism. He disagreed with the characterization of traditional design as overly dependent on the past and not enough engaged with the present. In his view, when a contemporary architect used traditional imagery, their action is more a comment on the present than on the past. Quote, the past is being used as an idea commenting on the present. In Gebhard's view, every generation of architects recognize they are adding to the traditional language they are using, that the process is not stagnant. Quote, thus the question of creativity, of the quality of design, is not a question of current fashion versus traditionalism. Rather, it has to do with the excellence of design which an architect realizes. In the context of Santa Barbara, another ingredient must be added in his view. And what ultimately counts is the city, its central core as the designed object. He saw that each building is part of a whole. He questions how well this is being carried out today. Gebhard recognized that the current postmodern era, again this is 85, is fascinating but a trying moment in architectural or landscape architectural design. Classicism is the only historical vocabulary well understood, and ironically that's what underpins modernism of the 1920s and 30s. Medieval images are not well understood, and that is the basis of much of the Andalusian tradition. The prevailing approach has been to see this in fragments, and then they're used as a basis for the entire building. And as I mentioned, two examples of contemporary design that he was very positive about were what we're looking at here, of course, with modification of the museum on the left. And then another that he mentioned, which I think he came to feel was a great success, was in particular the freeway bridge that spans the State Street underpass, and of course that was a great success. He felt as he worked in collaboration with Caltrans. Just a few concluding remarks. At the risk of concluding this lecture in tears, I'm trying not to do that, this process has been a continual reminder of the profound impact David Gebhard had professionally and personally for those of us who work closely with him. Fortunately, he has left a rich legacy. I will say that begins with his wonderful daughters and their families. Many of us enjoyed our friendships and professional relationships with him. But on a less personal note, but equally profound, is the impact he had on Santa Barbara's built environment. He lavished his deep affection for the city in every building he reviewed, every ordinance he helped craft with the intention of improving the city as a whole. And finally, the rich literature he created continues to impact us far beyond our immediate environment. Thank you for this opportunity to review the man and a portion of his work.
There we are. Well, sorry I didn't announce this before, but Dr. Bricker will take a few questions, and if you will hold up your hand, I'll bring the microphone so for the benefit of the entire audience to hear what your thoughts are. So, do we have anybody who cares to start off? Oh, there must be somebody. Yes, there's somebody.
His relationship with Pearl Chase and how they affect each other. I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear that.
What was his relationship with Pearl Chase?
I don't know much in detail. I think that they must have immediately recognized a lot of shared values. I know that with the Citizens Planning Association, which she was a founder of and headed up, He became a member rather quickly, and eventually by about 1970 was the president of that. And that, of course, was an organization where there was shared passion and activism. I know that the efforts, and Mary Louise could speak about this much more extensively than me, that when there was an effort to break the height limit or encourage a greater height limit in the city, that they joined forces and controlled and instituted, I think through, or promoted an ordinance, you can talk about this more than me, that limited the height of the city, feeling that the Spanish tradition of the city really required limitations of height. Again, it's this vision of the city as a whole.
I think of them as sort of brothers in arms,
Yeah,
if you,
yeah.
to use a phrase.
Brother, sister.
Okay, speaking of height, when I take people around town and show them El Paseo, I notice that there's this huge building that's just looming over us in the courtyard, and it's way more than 4 stories. I mean, maybe 6, maybe 5. But you know, at first people think, oh, and what is that? Is that part of El Paseo? And no, it's not. So what is the story? How did they get away with that?
I don't know, but the architect is Lutimer Riggs. It's also very
Because wasn't there a limit to the size? That was clearly higher than 4.
Comment here.
Oh, Bruin, with Bruin, okay. Oh, there was no city. They got a variance, there was no city charter limit, and that is what happened later with the, El Marisol, that's right, El Marisol project, yeah.
Excuse me, I've heard recently wrote a book about urban planning in the Santa Barbara district. And the story behind that building, it is significantly over the 60-foot height limit. But the owners of El Paseo threatened that if they couldn't, they also owned the adjoining property. And they threatened that they couldn't build this extra height, that they would probably have to tear down that Paseo or build something else. The planning commission was blackmailed. They were concerned about preserving El Paseo.
Because who owned the El Paseo at that time? Was it Trustkill? Oh,
The Suskies owned it.
Susky and yeah.
Yes. and
So it was,
then
it's very strange.
Mrs. Susky at the hearing said it cost us.
Okay. Very good. Oh, look for your book. Now, someone else has a question.
Hi, Laura. Could you talk a little bit about the legacy of Dr. Gebhard, his founding of the ADC, which is one of the most important archives in the country, and I think it was how amazing it really started out in a closed closet.
What? I mean,
You know,
what do
his creation of the architect design collection. I mean, when he had the presence to see in the 60s with the dominance of course, modernism, how period revival architecture was just overlooked and thought, you know, passé. And he saw, he had the real presence to see that these were important, and he started collecting, you know, these archives of Art Reginald Johnson, George Washington Smith, et cetera, you know, how important his legacy was, that he created this incredible archive that we have now.
He did, but I do want to point out that it's not just the traditionalists who are represented there. Remember, it started with Schindler, and then also Irving Gill was represented there. And there's quite an incredible balance. And what he did was, he wrote letters. He made a list of, okay, here are the architects I think we need to have represented in the archives. And then I've seen these letters, and what he said was, he tried to, if the architect was still alive, he tried to appeal to them by saying, don't you want your legacy to be represented in a public institution where your work can be seen by a much wider audience? And in other cases, they were, you know, the widows or the family members contacted him. What the very frustrating thing, after a while the word got out, you know, that he was collecting. And so people would call and they'd say, okay, I got some stuff. If you want it, you know, you have basically, I'll give you 2 hours to get here and to pick it up, or else it's going in the dumpster. And he did it. He, over and over again, the one time he told me that he didn't act quite quickly enough was with the widow of Ken Weber, a very important German modernist. And he, I don't know, he probably didn't delay that much, got to her place and she said, oh, well, I thought you'd only want these presentation boards. I didn't think you'd want the other drawings. And so that was one of these really hard lessons. So the collections at the ABC have been incredibly important. Both, I mean, there's a range of significance, right? There are major documents. They have been used for display purposes in exhibitions internationally. They have been used for the preservation, rehabilitation of one building after another. And it's not just the drawings, it's also the photographs, the manuscript material. You're absolutely right. You cannot say enough about how important that is. And you know, one could say, well, if he did nothing else, that would have been a huge contribution, but then he did all these other things too, you know. So.
Could you say more about his unfinished book on George Washington Smith?
Well, you know, it's not the only major work that he didn't finish. You know, I think what happened for David Gebhard was that he was so busy with so many things that these big writing projects that would have entailed him separating himself, saying no to many other important activities. I didn't really talk about his preservation work outside of Santa Barbara. He was very active in you know, advocacy and documenting buildings that would have been destroyed. So I think that, I mean, and fortunately, because he and Pat Gebhard shared so many interests, and she was a wonderful historian in her own right, that she was able to, she did the Smith book, she did the Purcell and Elmsley book, I think the history of the courthouse that she and Catherine Massey did was, you know, wasn't just a completion of his work. He was, you know, you can get a sense of his approach to a subject by looking at the Schindler book, you know, which was very innovative in terms of the range of questions he posed and sought to answer by looking at the architect's work. I think Smith is particularly, don't you think he had a particular passion about George Washington? I mean, it was like a deep passion that, and I think it was enhanced because he worked very closely with Luda Maria Riggs, who eventually he wrote a monograph on her, one of his last monographs. And, you know, and because it's so critical to understanding Santa Barbara, and I've never seen like a chapter outline of the book, so I couldn't tell you specifically what he was proposing to discuss. But his first, as I mentioned, his first exhibition was about George Washington Smith, and those exhibition catalogs, here's the other thing about those exhibition catalogs. For the longest time, and it's still true, In many cases, those catalogs were the only documentation on a particular architect. You know, this was true for Lloyd Wright, well, certainly for Smith. You could just kind of rattle off these names. And so that's a fantastic program that the museum is continuing, where they produce excellent catalogs that perpetuate the value of the exhibit. And he really started that. I can't be any more specific. I'm sorry, I don't know exactly what the chat.
A question about the guidebooks.
Yeah.
Because if you could talk a little bit more about that. Because the guidebooks were an interesting way to open up a discussion. And they were controversial at the time. Rainer Banner wrote a furious, terrible review of one of them. So could you talk a little bit more about how the guidebooks came about?
Well, as I mentioned, the first one was initiated by, well, I don't know if they initiated it or LA County Museum of Art came to them, but I believe that was also published in conjunction with a Society of Architectural Historians meeting in Los Angeles. So they thought, great, let's give them a document. Those East Coast historians, this will be a great opportunity, and they can take it around and really open their eyes to how wonderful the architecture was. They were very broad as far as their choice of works. They set up a number of rules for themselves. This is both David Gebhard and Bob Winter. The work had to still be surviving, so, with all these additions, some things were lost. I believe they felt pretty strongly that the work needed to be visually accessible. There may have been some cases where the work just was so important that they just needed to mention it. They were, in each of the chapter headings, they began with they were discussing, for instance, they discussed the freeway system. They were looking at the built environment as a whole. And, their taste in architecture was very broad. Gebhard always used this term. He talked about, that kind of a Catholic taste, right? Meaning a taste that wasn't subject to a kind of provincialism. And that was a goal that I think he always kept in his head, that he wanted to have reflected. He and Bob. The business about Rainer Banham was a very, very unfortunate. Banham wrote a review that was in the Society of Architectural Historians journal that was, he sort of was critical of the size of the guide, the inaccuracy of some of the maps. He was, he was sort of all over the map, suggesting that some things were, not worthy of inclusion, other things were omitted, and then they wrote back a very tough response. And I think that, I'm not sure that over the years, I heard David Gebhard say that, maybe it was a little too tough. It was, a lot of stuff got played out, a lot of animosity got played out. It's not really the greatest. But they did, David and I heard them on the same stage along with Esther McCoy when the planning for the Museum of Contemporary Art was underway. And they were, and the three of them were just fantastic in their vision for what MoCA could be. And I think they wanted maybe MoCA to collect, or some of them did, and obviously they weren't going to collect architecture. Sorry, that was kind of a long response.
Hi, my name is Jeff Pauley, and I'm a cousin of Tyra and Ellen, and so it was always Aunt Pat and Uncle Dave. And so you spent a lot of time up at the house. And I know nothing about architecture, literally. And we would sit at the dinner table, and it didn't matter what the topic was. it could be about sports or something, and then eventually we'd get back to architecture. And it was always a lesson, you know, it was always super interesting, and his knowledge was just, and he's just so driven. You know, you'd be in that library, you know, you showed the picture up there, that they had him, for those of you who've never seen it, it was just the coolest library ever. You know, the sliding, it was just great. And I used to house sit up there a lot when everybody was gone. And let me tell you, there was this whole protocol, like if a fire were to break out. And at first it started with, okay, get this book, you get this book, you get this document, and they had a fireproof vault downstairs. And then grab these chairs, there's some Schindler chairs there, you know, and then finally, you know, he just said, well, look, here's a number, call this as one of my graduate students, and get him over here, and he'll tell you what to get. That's kind of how you do that. But I would pick him up at the airport, and he would say, well, I need to stop by my office on the way back. And it was amazing. Yeah, this was before cell phones or anything, and there would be Post-it notes on his door, his faculty office door. And the Post-it notes, I mean, there would be hundreds of these things. David called me, David called me, David, you know. And then stacks of mail. I mean, it was just like grocery bags full of mail. I mean, he'd be gone like a week. And, you know, the phone would just be ringing all the time. I'm trying to get hold of Dave, you know, and he'd be off in New Mexico or someplace, you know. Anyway, my memories are very, very fond ones. He was a really, really interesting guy. He really was. And Pat, too. And Pat she was a remarkable person, too.
Well, with that, we thank you for your participation and attendance, and we have some Brie and Chablis in the courtyard waiting for you. But in conclusion, I want to thank Lauren, and I would hope that perhaps expect that some monograph on David from your hand come someday. Thank you. Please join us in the courtyard.